Hi everybody. I'm going to invite, I guess, the other panelists who are joining me in a moment. I just want to talk to you first of all, though, about some of the projects that I've worked on. I'm not going to take very long at all, but I want to draw your attention to a handbook that I produced. I have to say I'm not actually with UNESCO, I'm a consultant to UNESCO. That will get me into all sorts of United Nations level trouble if the misinformation that I'm an employee was to spread. So I'm here partly because I work for the Reuters Institute as a senior research fellow, and there I lead something called the Journalism Innovation Project. And we have focused in that project on newsrooms in the Global South, 3 newsrooms from the Global South, the Daily Maverick in South Africa, Rappler in the Philippines, and the Quint in India. And I chose those news organisations because they're making an impact as news organisations that are seeking to be sustainable and profitable, but they're doing so in the context of unprecedented existential crises, convergent existential crises, one of which, as we heard from Anne, in the Philippines and repeated in the other 2, is disinformation on a global viral scale. Disinformation that targets and swamps journalism, or attempts to. Disinformation that targets journalists and exposes them to enormous risk. And I'll just actually start by saying this report, I don't have any other copies with me other than this one, but it's available for free online, which assesses the innovative ways in which collaboratively and otherwise these news organisations are tackling disinformation on the front line in their daily work, and much of what they're doing does involve collaborations with platforms, as much as they cite the rise of the online world as one of the catalysts for this viral disinformation era we're surviving at the moment, but also with community organisations and academia. So there's some useful and instructive lessons here for you. It's called Lessons in Innovation: How International News Organisations Combat Disinformation Through Mission-Driven Journalism. And I just want to talk a little bit during the context of this session today about what that mission is. We've heard it underlined by Anne and others, but it's a mission to ensure that credible information is able to be surfaced in the context of this swamp. And this is the handbook that I was referring to, Journalism, Fake News, in inverted commas with a line through it, because as our colleagues at First Draft, and particularly Claire Wardle, have said over the years, the weaponisation of the term fake news is deeply problematic in and of itself. So journalism, fake news, bleep it out, and disinformation. Now this is also a highly collaborative attempt to tackle the crisis that is confronting journalism when it comes to disinformation, misinformation, and malicious forms of information. It's been produced, as I said, collaboratively, commissioned by UNESCO. I think we've got about 50 or 60 copies which are sitting over there, which you're free to take. We didn't have quite enough to put one in each of your little conference packs, but this is designed as an intervention commissioned by UNESCO, as I said, but as an intervention in journalism, education and training, both within an industry context, a tertiary context, and even in a school education setting. It contains 7 modules, which have been produced under the guidance of myself and Sherilyn Ireton, who's the World Editors Forum Executive Director. Claire from First Draft and another colleague wrote a chapter bringing forth their important and groundbreaking identification of the different types of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, as they refer to it. We also have chapters on the intersection of trust and disinformation and journalism in its most ethical and credible forms. We look at the history of disinformation, how it's arisen, and provide context for understanding the ways in which the social media era and the transformation of journalism through digital disruption have both facilitated and can be a provider of opportunities for combating disinformation. We look specifically at the need to really reboot media and information literacy, which has a long tradition in terms of equipping students to critically approach texts, as we heard from Anne, but rebooting that for a digital environment, which requires a whole lot of new skills, including fact-checking. And we have one of the gurus of fact-checking, I don't know if he's here today, Mansalis, sorry, Alexios Mansalis. I'm mixing him up with another Italian Greek colleague who has a very similar name. I don't know if Alexios is here, but he wrote a chapter on fact-checking, which is deeply practical and applicable to a range of settings. We look at social media verification from a visual perspective, from the video and image perspective, which is essential, and also importantly, as again Anne alluded to, the need to combat online harassment and abuse as a feature of orchestrated disinformation campaigns in particular. So there's a module and a chapter there focused on these sorts of state-linked and corporate-driven, in the case of the South African Bell Pottinger and Gupta leaks example, which we include there, particularly gendered, in other words, focused on the harassment of women as a means of chilling the journalism and chilling the freedom of expression that we all share. And I think that's the important point to take into the discussion that we're about to have, that this is and must be a collaborative response, that we have to reinterpret media literacy and media freedom, in fact, and freedom of expression as shared experiences, rights and responsibilities. So it's as much a role for the audience as it is for the journalist, as it is for the academic, as it is for the educator. So on that note, I'm going to encourage the other panelists to come up and join us here. And I'm sorry if I'm causing disruption to my microphone. Are we okay up the back there? Excellent, okay. So if I can welcome to the stage our panelists, and we have Janette Ballard, who is the Senior Project Manager from BBC's Young Reporter and World Service Group. Thanks, Janette. Just take a seat wherever you like and pick up one of the colourful microphones. Janette was director and producer within the BBC's TV Current Affairs division for 15 years. And a couple of years ago, she moved to the Reality Check team, which is BBC's fact-checking and claim-checking brand. And now, as I said, she heads up the BBC Young Reporter, which is targeting 11 to 18-year-olds, I think. And she's launched this in a range of countries around the world, including, you've got bureaus now in Nairobi, in Kenya, and Delhi in India as well. Great. Okay, Masato Kajimoto, who's joining us from Hong Kong, the University of Hong Kong. I just realised I'm the second Australian to speak, and I think there's an abundance of us here, so it's represent Australia and Hong Kong University as well. So Masato specialises in news literacy education and misinformation ecosystem research in Asia, where he's at the Centre for News Literacy, and he's also led a range of projects that take into account the variety of actors in this space. And next we have Anaïs Adriaens-Allemand. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your... It's okay. Thank you for joining us. She is with the CLEMI, which is the acronym in French, the French National Centre for Media and Information Literacy, which is a really important intervention by the French government in trying to bridge all of the worlds that we're talking about right now. And it involves schools, right? So it's schools, particularly looking at media literacy, information and education in schools, collaborating with journalists. So I'm looking forward to hearing how that works. And finally, Lacy Caruthers, who we've already heard from, who's going to join us on stage as well, who is, as you've heard, a director at google.org, but importantly, she was instrumental, as I understand it, in the launch of the Google News Initiative. So thanks, everybody. And we are going to try and get to questions for about 10 minutes at the end. So please save up, and if you've got something really burning to say that you feel a need to intervene with, then throw your hand up as we go, and I'll come to you if I can. So I'm going to start with you, Janette, actually, since I've started talking about journalism, and we are here under the auspices of the Google News Initiative. Can you tell us, from your perspective, where and how you're trying to respond to the sorts of problems that we've just heard outlined, which are really complex and difficult to understand, from the perspective of somebody producing content designed to intervene for school-age kids, really?
Yeah, okay, so hello, my name's Janette, and I'm actually going to apologise first because I have to leave after this session, so I won't be around later for the later Q&A. However, you may know that it's actually really easy to figure out somebody's email address if they work at the BBC. I'll just leave it at that.
Pro tip.
Yeah. You're all in media literacy. I'm sure you'll be able to work it out. At the BBC, we have, in a way, we have a broad approach to the media landscape. I mean, the media landscape, I don't need to tell this room, is an incredibly complex place. One of my favourite quotes is from Jerry Seinfeld. I might be amongst the older people in the room who will remember that culture reference. But, he has this line in one of his stand-ups where he says, isn't it amazing that all the news in the world fits perfectly into the newspaper every day? And, those days have gone, as we know. It's a multi-dimensional place. Even putting aside disinformation, even getting news that you might want to trust and rely on, you have so many places you can get it. So we know it's very complicated. And I suppose for me, so two things really. So I'll do, So the BBC can approach that in different ways. The BBC does, obviously we're a player in that landscape, right? But we also recognise our responsibilities in that landscape. And the Director General in particular, if you look at his speeches over the last few years, he brings it up a lot. He's concerned about disinformation, and he's very concerned about the responsibility that the BBC has in that space. And because of who we are and the kind of funding that we have, we can operate in different ways. So we do look at the problem from the fact verification point of view. We have BBC monitoring, we have reality check, we have a UGC team. Obviously, we have, we have a huge news gathering organisation and a trusted source of news. And so kind of, helping to be part of that setting of standards in the space is really important. We also, obviously, we have huge technology parts of the BBC who can also work on the technology side. And then in media literacy, what we have is our media literacy offering essentially comes out of two places. One is BBC Education, who do a lot of broader kind of media literacy stuff, largely focusing on young people. And then the other part is through BBC Young Reporter and BBC World Service Group's Beyond Fake News programme. And it happens in different ways. The Young Reporter, broadly, the Young Reporter programme is actually about helping journalism in schools. So some of the sort of things you were talking about, Anne, but with school-age children, helping them run their news clubs and so on. We also run they also run a competition so that young people can get their stories on air. And then we also have this workshop process where staff take a workshop around how to spot disinformation into schools. And that bit of the project is what's also launched globally in Nairobi, in Delhi, in Brazil. I might have forgotten someone, so forgive me if I've forgotten somewhere. And so that's broadly our offering. I think if I can sort of say where I think we can sort of go next.
Yeah. And what are the challenges?
Yeah. So one of the challenges is Matt knows me well enough to know that I'm a bit low tech, but I've brought a picture with me.
I love this.
Yeah.
Analog.
So here's my picture. So basically, my personal thing is this, and the reason this is my thing is because I was originally a content maker. I was a filmmaker. I was a journalist. And what journalists and filmmakers always want, or invariably want, is for their content to go further. So my question is always, how can we make this content go further, better? And part of that is about mapping, which First Draft and Reuters Institute do. And we've done a bit of research around that as well, and lots of universities are part of that. The second part of that is I would like to know more about what works so that I can make my content work better and go further. I can chop it up and I can do it differently. But I would also like to work in this space. So I can't do both. Could you hold my book for me?
Collaboration.
There we are. So if this is all the things that are happening in the world, and these are the journalists, and this is a kind of curation editorial process, and these are the avenues like TV or newspapers or radio whereby stories got to the people. You might have to hold it quite firmly. So that's like the olden days, right? We all recognize that from the olden days. Of course, what's happening now is loads of this and loads of this. So people are sending stories straight to people. And, a lot of it is getting bypassed from this, right? So all of us here work in different parts of this map. So verification tends to happen here. Good journalism happens here. the editorial curation happens here, maybe with some additional fact checking there. And here we've maybe got technology working here. And here's where the media literacy people are working with the people. And my thing is, let's look at this relationship here, right? Let's look at the moment that it hits. And that's partly because, of course, I would love to equip every person in the world with critical thinking tools so that they never get conned or fooled by any of this. But maybe they will also need some help. And your skills as media literacy experts are to help these people direct their focus and research more accurately, in particular, the technology people. So technology people can do all sorts of things cleverly with computers and digital and code and all the rest of it. But if they can also feed off your knowledge of what works and what messages are best and how to do it, I think there's a really interesting collaboration there to be had.
All right, let's unpack that further as we go on. Masato, you work at the intersection of tertiary education and journalism. What are you finding are the biggest challenges, particularly in some of the really complex and high-risk countries that you operate in within Southeast Asia?
Well, I would say lack of resources is probably the biggest challenge we have. I mean, UNESCO places media and information literacy as one of the pillars to combat human rights issues like hate speech, gender equality, racial diversity. But in Asia, we have countries where hate speech has been pushed and disseminated by the governments or military. How do you combat that? Teaching and learning materials developed in the Western countries often, take democracy for granted, free speech for granted, and it doesn't work like that in many Asian countries. In some countries, census data is a classified governmental secret because they don't want people to know how racially diverse the country actually is, right? So we are working under that kind of environment in Asia, and unfortunately, because we don't have much resources, when it comes to media and information literacy education, we heavily rely on the materials developed in Western countries, and that's a huge challenge for us. It doesn't really work that way. So, for example, Stanford University's program for the lateral reading, it works excellent and great if you are researching in English language, right? In the countries where the information is tightly controlled, even if you try to read horizontally, you get identical cookie-cutter information because it's controlled by the government. So it's extremely hard to identify what is credible. And it's always like this. If you go to WHO website, they have a list of places you can go to get credible vaccine information. None of the websites WHO lists is in Asian language.
Wow.
They have English and other European languages, but no Asian language, not even Japanese. I mean, so I feel like our challenge is, first of all, I don't feel like Asia is part of the global conversation right now. And like Anne said, starting from 2012, we've been saying that Facebook is a big issue in Myanmar. Somebody's got to do something. In 2014, we saw a very political divide on Facebook, and we started researching and monitoring what's going on. And that was 2014, 2 years before what happened in the US. But whatever we say, whatever we write, we had no public attention whatsoever in academia until Donald Trump got elected. And suddenly my email inbox is flooded with the request, hey, Masato, I realized that you've been doing this in Asia. Do you want to share? So I think that's the biggest challenge. We want to be collaborating. But first of all, you should notice what sort of things we are facing in Asia first.
Indeed. And I mean, it's one of the things that Maria Ressa, who I've spent several years working with and spent time embedded in her newsroom recently for this Reuters report, points to, that she was sounding the alarm in the beginning of 2016, particularly around Facebook's role in facilitating disinformation in the lead up to the Duterte election, and was banging her head against many walls. But you pointed out to me too that, I didn't say this, but the UNESCO handbook I flagged is being translated into 13 languages. Several of them are already out. That includes Chinese, Burmese, Vietnamese, and a range of other Southeast Asian languages, which is great. So those resources will be in Asian languages. But as you very astutely observed, it's all very well to have tools like that, but you can be at serious risk even in trying to implement these sorts of lessons and methodologies with your students.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. Because I'm in this field, and there are many educators in Asia who think the same way. And also journalists who are really gutsy enough, like Maria Ressa, who could actually fight against that. But we were talking about regular public schools, small classrooms, I mean, all around the countries, and teachers, for high school teachers and junior high school teachers to talk about racial discrimination in a country where the government and military is pushing certain race to be advantageous, it's extremely hard.
Yeah, and it really underlines, I would argue, the need for that sort of robust, independent, investigative accountability journalism, which is hard enough to do before you even get to this sense of trying to empower citizens and teachers. Thank you, Masato. We'll come to you next, Anaïs. Your challenges are similar, but without the context of the level of state propaganda and control, and frankly, physical risk, which is one of the issues that have to be acknowledged in trying to deal with these issues. But from the perspective of a liberal democracy with a current president who's actually, quite vocal about trying to combat the problem of disinformation, can you share with us, from your perspective, what some of the big challenges are that remain, and perhaps how you're trying to combat them through your project?
First, thank you for inviting CLEMI to this panel. As you say, we have a governmental organization, and there is a very clear institutional interest in this subject. CLEMI has been existing for 30 years, so it's a very old concern for France. But since the Paris attack, it has been even more important for us. In France, media information literacy is part of pupils' curricula, so there is a high level of awareness, have you said, but for us the biggest challenge is to go from awareness to a concrete commitment in schools, and to have a real education toward critical thinking. For that, we have a two-side approach. First, it's teacher training. We have a concrete offer of teacher training because in France, media literacy is a cross-subject issue. So we have to train teachers so that they are able to help children reach this this awareness toward media. So I think it is even more important because students are younger and younger to have screen use and an approach toward media. Therefore, we have to train teachers for primary school to help young people and to guide them toward this. And this issue of teacher training is very important for us. And the second aspect is to create a link. We consider ourselves as a go-between between schools and journalists and media. For instance, we organize each year for 30 years a media and press week at school, where teachers and journalists can exchange and media really can get into class and teacher can take their students toward journalists. So this is a two-sided approach. We want to help exchange of culture between teachers and journalists so that they are able to have a more cooperative approach.
Okay, great. So, and tech companies involved now in this collaboration as well. So it's not just institutional media, news media, and schools and the government, but also social platforms, for example.
Yeah, it is starting, but it's not as strong an involvement as it could be. It's really growing right now, but we really have usually a more traditional approach between journalists and schools, and there is an importance to have a more role with tech media.
Okay, interesting, and perhaps an opportunity to put on your plate, Lacy, from Google. What is the role of big tech, particularly the platforms that have frankly been implicated in the disinformation crisis that we find ourselves in and called out? Maria Ressa, we keep talking about her, but very much was vocal about the role that Facebook played and its slowness to respond. Similar allegations have been put at the feet of Google in reference to YouTube, for example. So what are the challenges from your perspective at the moment, and how are you trying to address them?
Yeah, so I think at Google, we are obviously committed to ensuring that when our users come to our platforms and our products, that they're able to discern what is credible information and what is not credible information. And we are also committed to, through efforts that we're supporting from a lot of the folks in this room, that when users travel elsewhere on the web and other platforms, that they have those skills to be able to discern in other places. So I mentioned earlier, my focus has really been on establishing this fund to support organizations who have been active in this space for a long time. So my perspective is really thinking about that aspect as it's a complement to the work that we're doing on our products and platforms. And we'll actually have a whole panel this afternoon of folks who are really the experts at Google on what we're doing around surfacing authoritative content and ensuring that users have the context around the information that they're seeing on our platforms. So I think in reflecting on this question, it's really from my perspective as a funder and the bird's eye view that we have that's somewhat unique in terms of seeing all of the efforts across this space, really when it comes to NGOs and academia in particular. And I think the challenges that have surfaced for us are similar to ones that have been shared by other panelists. I think one is that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to media literacy. Often we have different definitions about what we're talking about, different governing structures, different contexts, different cultures and customs. And I would say when we first started this work, being new to this space, we really were focused on scale, and I think very quickly realized, how do you scale something from one market to another and quickly and reach millions of people, and very quickly realized that doesn't quite work, and it's not as easy as it sounds. I think the second insight that we've had is that we really need to ensure that we're reaching marginalized groups. And I think, as Masato shared, I think in some cases it really does become a human rights issue, and misinformation often targets these marginalized groups. But for a number of systemic inequities around lack of access to tech or language barriers, or lack of resources in low-income schools, these groups are often not reached by these kinds of programs, and I think it's really critical that we keep that in mind. And I think the Canadian Journalism Foundation, in partnership with Civics, is doing some really interesting work around reaching First Nation groups in Canada. The Stanford team is doing great work focusing on Title I, low-income schools in the U.S., so some interesting work to learn from there. And then the last challenge I would cite is just, I think, to echo again what these folks shared, I think there's a real opportunity to build a greater evidence base of what works. And it is very complicated given the variables that we're talking about, but I think there's a real, as a funder, we're always looking for evidence of impact or evidence of potential impact, and it's not as easy as it sounds, but I think a real opportunity to do that.
And also research that provides the evidence to enable you to act. Would you say that there's also a need for research that looks at these sort of collaborative efforts as well to give you opportunities to invest there? Yes,
absolutely. Okay. Yeah, and I think, everyone in this group I'm sure knows, but Ofcom in the UK, I think, is sort of the shining example of doing that foundational research that does then inform the kind of interventions that we might take.
Okay, so other than research, I'm going to go in reverse order now and just tap you for perhaps insights into the ways in which you might overcome some of these impediments. You've identified research. What are the other sorts of blocks, if you like, when trying to deal cooperatively and collaboratively, which is so essential in tackling this problem?
Yeah, I would say, I'm not biased at all, but I think doing more events like this in terms of convening folks and bringing different actors together who might not otherwise interact or be in the same rooms together, I think there's a huge opportunity to break down barriers and opportunities for greater collaboration. I think we also, again, from this funder vantage point, I think we also see a lot of groups working on very similar issues in very similar ways. And I think there's a lot of, particularly within the NGO space, a lot of opportunity for further collaboration and partnership there to ensure that each group is not reinventing the wheel every time they're.
Indeed, the replication is obvious, isn't it, to
Yes.
those of us looking down? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I would say, again, from a funder perspective, I don't think there's a lot of incentive for NGOs to cooperate in this space, from a resourcing, funding perspective, from a credit perspective. But I think when these groups are able to come together, it's so much more than the sum of its parts, and I think it can just be really powerful.
Yeah. Okay, great insights. Can I come to you next, Anaïs, just thinking about what the barriers might be and how you might sort of suggest they be overcome. And we left off where you were saying that it's been a slow evolution, this sort of attempt to collaborate with the platforms in an organisation that we might term legacy, to borrow from the framing of news organisations.
I think what you said is very true. We have to acknowledge that each one of us has a different entry point for media literacy, and that everyone has his own concern, whether it's screen use, whether it's analyzing media, whether it's editing its own media through social media. And teachers, journalists, social platform does not come through the same way, and this can be quite tricky for us. We are trying in France, we try to create, to have this role of cooperation and to contribute to different actors, to speak together in order to make a coherent approach. But it's not always easy, and there are lots, even just in France, already have a lot of actors that does not always, sometimes they do kind of same things and they do not cooperate, or sometimes they have different approach and they are not able to work together. So that's what we are trying to do.
Okay, lots of opportunity for probing that as the day goes on. Masato, what about those issues that you raised? What would your top recommendation be for trying to address these impediments to using some of the tools we've talked about already in countries that you work in through a more collaborative approach?
Right. I think really integrated collaboration is really difficult to do, and especially if we are talking about education. Education is always long term.
Yes.
You don't see the results in 1 year, 2 years, but oftentimes the funding available for NGOs and educational institutions in Asia is pretty much just for one-off workshops. It could be 3 days, 1 week, and that's the end of it, and that's the end of collaboration as well.
Yeah.
And that model might look great because if you do pre and post testing, the research shows that it worked during that period of time, right? 10 days later, probably everybody forgets everything.
Yeah.
But, so I think.
So how you embed the knowledge becomes very important.
So how do we sort of envision long-term collaboration that is sustainable is something that I'm always thinking about. And there are some of the things that we tried at the University of Hong Kong, and it worked. Sometimes it didn't work other times, so we learned a lot as well. I just wanted to say that. Workshops is great. I mean, this kind of gathering is great, but I've been attending lots of those discussions since 2017, pretty much. And what I find most interesting is that when we talk about this sort of like high-level media landscape and what we should do, it tends to be really ideological or superficial on the surface. And I find it much more interesting to have teachers on stage and then show actually what they do in
resources.
classrooms. Yeah. So best practice sharing is the type of conference that I really like to go because I learn a lot. We don't directly collaborate, but some teachers have inventive way to teach some basic concept in Indonesia. I can actually steal that idea and turn it into my teaching as well. And somebody who's doing interesting thing in Myanmar, I might take. So I think that kind of collaboration, it's a really loose collaboration. You don't really work together, but you always share information. Is
there a collaborative website that allows that sort of cross-pollination already?
Language is the big issue.
Yeah, no, but I mean in multiple languages.
Right. Not that I know of. I mean,
maybe there's an
UNESCO can take that law.
UNESCO has a lot of resources in multiple languages, but there's not a space where people can collaborate, within working groups digitally, for example, where there is possibility with connectivity, of course, to enable that to happen.
I would like to see that if that could be done. Yeah.
Okay, great. Janette, back to you.
I don't have a picture now. Yeah, so I just want to quickly revisit scale in sort of in relation to this idea of longevity.
Yes.
Because I wouldn't want to take scale off the table ever. I totally accept it's difficult and it's never a fits all. But as people have been saying, with more knowledge and sharing of what works and best practice, some of that could then be turned into things that could be scaled to keep the message going and reinforce things. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about collaboration. So I suppose I just wanted to say, in terms of the BBC, I would totally understand if you thought 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, that we were not an open door. What I would say is we are an open door. And I think actually what I've found in this space is that most NGOs, most companies, schools are largely open doors. And we just need to start walking through those doors more and talking. So we've increased our transparency in our journalism. We work much more in partnership with people, all sorts of people from all sorts of different walks of life and organizations and academia and so on. It's actually in our charter that we cannot operate alone in the media space, so we are an open door for partnerships. And I think that's a sort of, it's our own mindset that we need to keep pushing towards that, but also to get that message out there to other people that, we're an open door.